Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the preservation of family photographs. I'm Stephanie Lamson. On behalf of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee and the Preservation Week Working Group, I'm happy to introduce this free webinar as part of ALA's Preservation Week. Many thanks to our sponsors of today's webinar, Archival Products. Our presenter today is Debra Hess Norris, Chair of the Art Conservation Department at the University of Delaware and Professor of Photograph Conservation. Norris has authored more than 30 articles and book chapters in the care and treatment of photographic materials, emergency response, ethics, and conservation education. She has taught more than 100 workshops and seminars for conservators and allied professionals, and has lectured and consulted on the preservation of photographic collections worldwide. Before we begin, a few quick notes on today's webinar. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the question box on your screen, and Debbie will do her best to answer as many questions as possible at the conclusion of her presentation. Also, please note that today's presentation will be recorded and available at the ALCTS webinar website and on YouTube. You're also invited to use the Twitter back channel hashtag ALCTSCE to interact with other participants during the webinar. However, please continue to submit questions for the presenters in the question box on the screen. The presenter and host will not monitor Twitter during the presentation. With that, I'll turn the program over now to Debbie. There may be a short pause.
Hello, this is Debbie. I'm hoping everyone can see my first image. Maybe someone could send me a note through the question box and just say yes. You can see this title slide. But anyway, oh gosh, okay, great. I think you can all see it. This is a real honor and privilege for me. I'm super excited to be presenting on this topic today, and I only wish that we were all in one auditorium so we could see each other and learn from each other. And it's really great that there are not only so many individuals signed up, but that you come from across the United States and really around the world. Because in the end, our goal to preserve this photographic heritage is certainly shared. And I've had the great privilege to lecture in many countries around the world on the subject of photograph preservation. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to run through my PowerPoint, but I'm happy to take questions. Stephanie will moderate, and then I'll leave 15 minutes at the end for additional questions, and we'll do the best we can to cover issues surrounding the preservation of our photographic heritage with, of course, a focus on family photographs. Many of you I haven't met, but for some who I have, you probably are well aware of the fact that I'm a huge Beatles fan, which is why the title is Here, There, and Everywhere. Here's a picture of me actually in my favorite color, teal, on the right, and I wanted to also thank Heather Brown, who's one of our graduate students in the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation, majoring in photograph conservation. And I'll tell you a little bit about this program at the end if there's time, but I wanted to show you a picture of Heather and thank her for her help in compiling this webinar today. And also, I want to dedicate this to my grandmother, who you see here. My grandmother passed away when she was 106. She was Norwegian, and what did she love doing most of all was really looking at her photographs. And so I often, in speaking about the preservation of photographic materials, often call that talk, Don't Leave Grandma in the Attic. We all have photographs that we value greatly, and many of them, as you see here, are early from the 19th century. This is a hand-colored salted paper print. The salted paper process was one of the first photographic printing processes. It was introduced around 1841 and popular in the United States until 1865. This one is particularly beautiful and in very good condition, and as we work through this webinar, we'll speak about some of the challenges that photographs face in terms of preservation and deterioration. But this particular image is quite gorgeous, and of course it's hand-colored because one of the challenges with early photography is that it was monochromatic. And so photographers worked in many ways to hand-color their images, whether they were early Daguerreotypes, which are photographs on silver-based copper, and I'll show you some of those in a moment, or salted paper prints, as you see here. Of course, the whole issue of color photography is resolved in the the 20th century with the introduction of the color photograph, an example of which you see here from 1959. And I show you this just again as a beautiful example of a wonderful family photograph that's in relatively good condition, certainly one to be valued, but in this case somewhat faded and yellowed, which is typical of these color photographs from the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Unfortunately for all of us, photographic materials are endangered in our homes, in our libraries, archives, museums, historic houses really around the world. And these are just, again, two typical examples of photographic degradation, a tintype on your left and an albumen photograph on your right. So the tintype is a photographic process from the 19th century on iron, which is why if you look through the sort of the center of the image, and I hope you might see my pointer, I'm not sure if you can or not, but you'll see that the image has begun to rust through the center where it was probably folded or bent. Thinking back to that salted paper print, which I showed you earlier, you will see that the cheeks in these little boys are hand-colored. And these early tintypes, which are definitely monochromatic, were often hand-colored in their cheeks to make the individuals look a little bit more lifelike. So this tintype is in relatively good condition, but it has begun to rust because the support is iron. The photograph on your right, and I do see that you can see the pointer, so that's great. Thank you for telling me that, is known as an albumen print. It's a photograph that's made with the white of hen's eggs, and I'll be talking more about this process in a moment because this is a process that really dominates the 19th century. In this case, you can see that this photograph of the baby is very badly faded, and there is a significant loss of what we call loss of highlight detail in the gown of the baby, in that you no longer can make out the details of the lace. One of the challenges with 19th century photography is that you often see extensive fading in the highlights, such as you see with the baby here. Another example of typical photographic print deterioration, this is a black and white photograph, or what we call silver gelatin developed out. And in this case, this photograph from Cuba, as you can see, has been housed in a poor environment, in a high relative humidity, damp environment, and it's begun to deteriorate quite significantly owing to the presence of moisture and mold. So this is sort of moisture and mold related damage on this particular photograph. And this is another challenge that we face in the preservation of these materials, which is why if I only had 2 minutes, which thankfully I don't, I would impress upon all of you how important it is not to house your photographs in the basement or in the attic where humidity temperatures are especially high. Temperatures are high and humidity especially high as well, because it is high temperatures and high relative humidity conditions that will advance the degradation of photographic materials. Many of you probably have color photographs in your collections, as you see here, and one of the challenges with these materials is that they do fade. These are comprised of dyes, organic dyes, cyan, magenta, and yellow. And these dyes tend to fade in the dark, and they also fade in the light. And they definitely require controlled environmental conditions to try and minimize this kind of deterioration, which is probably something that you have seen in your own family collections. It's ironic, really, that some of the least permanent photographic prints in our family collections are those that are more recent. The black and white photographs that you might have of your grandparents or of your relatives are probably generally in good condition, and these more recent color photographs may be faded and yellowed, as you see here. You'll also note that some of these photographs look very red or magenta, and that is because the cyan or the blue dye has faded, as has the yellow dye most likely, leaving behind that magenta color or that magenta dye. So anyway, I want to keep moving through this. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about photographic negatives, but this is an example of some of the typical film-based, acetate film-based negative deterioration that we do see quite commonly in museums, libraries, and archives around the world. In this case, the film has begun to shrink, and the emulsion, which is on top of it, than channels, as you can see in this image. There are many references and resources, and I did want to be certain that as we go through this presentation I mention these, and you'll have access to the PowerPoint so you can copy this information down. But these are 3 books. The first 2 are general guidelines on caring for family treasures that are well written and very comprehensive. They address topics far beyond photographic materials, but they each have content on photographic materials as well that I hope you'll find useful. And then the final book on this list is much more detailed, a guide to preventive conservation of photographic collections. It will provide much more information on issues surrounding proper environmental control, proper storage, cold storage for color collections, etc. All 3 are some of many really excellent resources that you might want to make available to yourself. When you're looking at photographic materials, you often begin to realize that these are real composite structures. They're composed typically of some kind of a support. With a photographic print, it would be a paper support that's coated with a transparent binder layer. That binder is a transparent material that holds the final image material in suspension, as you see in this cross-section. So you can see you have a primary support, a paper support that's coated with a binder, and then this final image material is held in suspension on that transparent binder. The materials vary, however. The supports throughout the history of photography can include paper, but also glass and iron, as is true with the tintype, silver-plated copper, true of the Daguerreotype, plastic, textiles, leather, wood. There are all different kinds of supports in photographs. Binders tend to be a shorter list, shorter number of options really, as you can see here. Albumen, which is the white of hen's eggs, which is used for the albumen photograph in the 19th century. Collodion, a form of a polymer, and a gelatin, which is a commercially prepared protein. So these are materials that are clear and transparent that are used throughout the history of photography. Gelatin is used today. Collodion, which is cellulose nitrate, or albumen, the whites of hen's eggs, was used in the 19th century. And then the final image material is that material that absorbs and scatters light that you see when you're looking at a photograph. And even here you can see that these materials vary quite significantly, from dyes to pigments to platinum metal, gold, iron salts, and of course metallic silver. It's not important to understand all these materials, but I show you this just so you begin to appreciate the wide variety of, and complexity really, of photography from its introduction in the 1840s to the digital materials that you see today. So let's talk a little bit about some of these different materials that you're likely to encounter in your own family collection. I've just picked a few to address in a bit more detail. In the beginning of photography, we have what's known as early direct positive processes. That simply refers to the fact that these very early processes, such as the Daguerreotype, which you see here, a beautiful hand-colored image, these materials are made without a negative. You would take that light-sensitive, silver-plated copper support and place it directly into a camera, and therefore it's known as a direct positive. Very different from photography, as we know later in the 19th and the 20th century, where you're using negatives to produce a photographic print. One of the most common early direct positive processes is the Daguerreotype, which is introduced, as you can see here, in 1839 and popular in the United States until the 1860s. It was introduced in France, very quickly came to the United States. So Daguerreotype support is silver-plated copper. And the image is actually quite complex. As you can see in my slide, it's a gold, mercury, silver amalgam. For this reason, these photographs are very fragile. You can see this beautiful portrait actually from the George Eastman House has also been hand-colored in the cheeks and in the lips, something you see with these early daguerreotypes. And you'll also note that it's protected with a metallic mat, a cover glass, and then this piece, this metal foil that wraps around it. And that whole package then is inserted into a folding leather case. You may have some of these daguerreotypes in your collection. They may not be in excellent shape. Here's one that's much more deteriorated, where the glass, the cover glass, has broken, allowing for the intrusion of air and moisture and causing corrosion of that silver-plated copper support. So the dark film that you see here around the outer edges at the interior of the mat is actually silver corrosion of that daguerreotype plate. These materials are fragile. You need to be careful in handling them, certainly handling loose daguerreotypes particularly, because that image is simply a silver-gold mercury amalgam. Other examples of early direct positive processes, so we're talking now about early photographs in your collections, include the tintype, which you see here. And tintypes are actually, as I mentioned earlier, on an iron support that's coated with a black lacquered layer. They may be matted into paper mats. This is sort of a strange, actually, tintype of this child, again hand-colored, or more often they're loose, as you see here. So this is a process that's introduced and very popular in the United States throughout the 19th century, introduced in 1856. It's on an iron support that's coated with a black lacquer. The image material is actually silver in a cellulose nitrate binder, and they're often hand-colored and often varnished. And this varnishing then protects them from fading and deterioration. So if you have tintypes in your collection, you might know or notice they're a bit yellowed. But they probably are in relatively good condition. These were portraits that were done inside, for the most part, in studios, as you see here in this family photograph. Or here, this detail of the woman, again, the presence of the hand coloring in the cheeks. And I show you this just for fun. This is Heather, my student who's helped in putting together this webinar. But this is her self-portrait, which she made on coated aluminum. There are many opportunities across the nation for you all to sign up for courses that involve early photography where you can actually make some of these processes, and I urge you to do so because that's the best way to appreciate the difficulty, actually, and the time that was involved in producing these materials in the 19th century. Another resource that I think you will find very useful is through the George Eastman House Museum of Photography in Rochester, New York. They have a series of really wonderful photographic process videos that you can watch that show you how these processes were made. So if you have daguerreotypes, as you see at the bottom of the screen, where the daguerreotype plate is being heated up and washed on the right, you can sort of understand and appreciate better the difficulty that was involved in the very steps that were taken to make that plate light sensitive, to create an image and then to protect it for future preservation. Now, in addition to direct positive materials, you might also have print materials, a whole variety from the salted paper process to color photography. And I thought I would just spend a little bit of time showing you examples without going into a lot of detail, but some of the kinds of materials that you may have in your own collection. Some of these will be photographic postcards, as you see here. In this case, another example of a hand-colored photograph, a silver gelatin print. But there's a variety of photographic print processes both in the 19th century, some of which are listed here, as well as the 20th century. The salted paper process is highlighted simply because this portrait that you see here is a salted paper print, again, one of the earlier photographic processes introduced in the United Kingdom, popular in the United States as well. It's probably unlikely that you have salted paper prints in your family collection, but you most definitely will have albumen prints, a process that dominates the 19th century. At the very end of the list is the cyanotype or the blueprint process. A photograph here from the J. Paul Getty Museum by Anna Atkins, who was actually one of the first photographers to create photographically illustrated books, and she did this wonderful study of plant specimens, which you see here. But in this case, the cyanotype process was popular sort of the turn of the 19th century. It was used for architectural drawings and also for family photographs. Someone's asked, what is salted paper? And I think, actually, I can go back and I'll answer that question just quickly. Salted paper refers to the fact that the photographer takes a piece of good quality, 100% rag, 100% cotton rag paper, and immerses it in a solution of table salt or sodium chloride. That paper is not light sensitive, but once that paper is dried, it's then coated with a silver nitrate. and silver nitrate will react with table salt, sodium chloride, to form the light-sensitive salt, silver chloride. And from that, then, you can produce a photographic print or photographic process. Many of the processes on this list, except for the cyanotype and the platinum process, are based on the light sensitivity of silver halides, silver chloride, for example. And salted paper simply refers to the fact that this paper was salted with table salt to make it light sensitive. It's important and interesting to sort of see how all these processes evolve. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the slide, but I just wanted to show you a sense of it. You see the salted paper process in the 1840s all the way through to chromogenic color photography in the 1960s and beyond. And of course, the present day is dominated entirely by digital processes. You can also see in this chart a bit of an evolution in colors. The earlier photographic processes tend to be more brown or purplish brown in color, and then as you move into black and white papers at the turn of the 20th century, 1905, you see that the photographs become more black and white until you begin to see color photographs dominating in the 1960s. Another important resource where you can find lots of information on photographic processes is the graphics atlas that you see here, part of the Image Permanence Institute website. You should go to this site, explore it. You can find out information about all the different processes, how they were done, what they look like, and how to identify them one from another. So I recommend this as a really wonderful interactive site. Someone's asking, where does sepia fit into all this? Sepia simply often refers to just a color, that the photographs are brown or sepia in color. There also are sepia-toned photographs, which are black and white photographs that were toned with silver sulfide or sulfide of some kind to produce silver sulfide, and these were popular in the 1930s and 1940s. What you see here is an Albumen photograph, and the Albumen photograph, again, is introduced in 1851 and dominates the 19th century. So many of you are likely to have these photographs that may be mounted onto a variety of different cards in your family collections. I won't go into an enormous amount of detail, but I thought you might be interested to see that, in fact, these photographs are made by using the whites of hen's eggs. As you see here, these are screenshots taken from the video that I referred to earlier. So you collect the whites of hen's eggs, you add to that a salt of some kind, and you then float that paper on a solution of egg white, salted egg white. To make that paper light sensitive, it's dried and then floated again on a solution of silver nitrate, forming light sensitive silver chloride in the paper support. It's then placed in contact with a negative. In the 19th century, these were glass plate negatives, as you see here. By the way, when you're handling negatives, be sure to wear gloves. But you can see this beautiful 19th century image here. And that then is placed in contact with a negative into printing frames out into the sun. And here you see a wonderful example of a large printing frame establishment in the United Kingdom where all of these printing frames, which you see here, are out in the sun while the images are being printed. And this gentleman is monitoring the extent of printing. When the photograph is fully printed out, the printing frame is removed from the sun, and the photograph is then fixed to remove remaining light-sensitive salts and washed, resulting in an image, as you see here. Go to that video on albumen when you have a chance, and you'll see the whole process being done. I think you'll find that very interesting. But these albumen prints vary in formats. You might have small carte de visites, as you see here, that are about 2.5 by 4.25 in size, or larger cabinet cards, 4.25 by 6.5. All these images are brown in color, purplish brown in color, and that's really because they've been created through the printing out process. If you go back to that cross-section that we talked about earlier, you'll see that with the albumen print, it's a 100% rag paper support that's coated with an egg white binder and a silver image that's been toned with gold for greater permanence. So these materials tend to be on a thin paper support. Again, it's a silver image. This particular photograph that you see here from the Metropolitan is another example of a beautifully hand-colored photograph. Unfortunately for us, the egg white binder will yellow over time. The silver image does fade. And in times, the binder layer, the albumen binder layer, will begin to crack. So when you look at these photographs under high magnification, 40 times or greater, sometimes you'll see this characteristic cracking in the egg white binder. Again, this kind of deterioration is caused by exposure to high temperature, high relative humidity conditions, fluctuations in environment. So whatever you can do to protect your photographs by housing them, for example, in an interior closet in your home, in protective sleeves and boxes that we'll talk about later, may begin to prevent this kind of deterioration from occurring. But it's very common to see albumen photographs that are yellowed, that are a bit faded, and that may be cracked and crazed, as you see here. Another photographic process that begins to certainly replace the albumen print. I don't mean to imply that these are the only print processes, because there are so many that are available, but given our time, I wanted to focus on those that are most common. I'm hoping you can hear me. I see someone said they've lost the sound. Please let me know if that's true for all of you. But the silver gelatin photograph, which you see here, the black and white photograph, is one that becomes popular. It's introduced in the late 1880s, really. It starts to become popular in 1895. It's very popular by 1905. Through 1960, and I'm certain that you have these in your collection. These tend to be black and white because they're produced in a different way. They're not printed out in the sun like the albumen print, but rather these are produced in a dark room through chemical development. And in this case, the binder is not albumen, but rather gelatin, a commercially prepared protein. Unfortunately, like the albumen photograph, these photographs do have a tendency to fade and deteriorate, although this particular image, I would say, is in relatively good condition, not badly faded or deteriorated in any way. Many silver gelatin black and white photographs look a little bit more like this photograph, this really wonderful portrait that's quite charming and engaging. You can see from 1927. But in this case, that black and white image has faded, so it appears a little bit more brown and deteriorated, and you can particularly see the fading here. Can you see it? Boy, I wish I could see you guys. Anyway, hopefully you can see this fading in her hair. A common problem with these photographs that you might see in your own collection is this silver mirroring, which is this deterioration, this iridescence that you see in the dark image areas of this particular photograph. And this is caused, again, by exposure to poor environmental conditions, high temperature, high relative humidity, and the use of poor storage enclosures, cardboard and other poor quality materials that give off pollutants that attack the silver image. Finally, as we sort of move through these different processes, and again, just trying to identify those that will likely to be present in your own family collections, you certainly have many, many color photographs. This is a wonderful one from 1959. It's great when these are annotated in this way. I urge you all to take time to go through your photographs and to make notes about who they are and recollections and memories that you have about them, so that those can be saved and treasured for future generations. But in this case, this photograph, we call these chromogenic color. They're color photographic processes. They really dominate the 20th century, certainly by 1940, 1945. And what's different about these versus the black and white photograph that I showed you, let me go back for a minute actually, this black and white photograph, or the albumen print, is in this case the final image material is actually comprised of organic dyes. There is no silver. So the albumen print is a form of silver, a silver image. The black and white photograph is a silver image, and this is actually organic dyes. Cyan, magenta, and yellow dyes. And these dyes fade in the dark and they fade in the light. And for that reason, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, these photographs may appear more magenta or more cyan or yellow, depending on how they were made and how they've been, how they deteriorate. Someone's asking, why do I cut silver gelatin off at 1960? Oh, okay, that's an excellent question, actually, and that has to do, I think, with this slide. These are dates of popularity. In fact, luckily for us, there are still photographers who are working in the silver gelatin process. Not too many of them, but there are black and white materials that are still available. So the dates that I'm sharing with you are not necessarily the end date, but rather the dates where these processes sort of dominated the market. So by 1960, we began to see a domination of color photography. So I hope that that's clear, and that's a great question, and I'm glad that someone asked that. And Stephanie, don't hesitate to jump in if you see questions that are coming up that I should answer as I go. I'm trying to watch the questions as I speak, but as you guys can imagine, that can be a challenge.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Okay, so so chromogenic color, again, 1940 is when this process becomes popular. Again, these have a gelatin binder, and you do see presence of dye fading. You also see often with the photographs that have borders, as you see here, that the borders become a little bit yellowed. This has to do with the way the photographs were made. In fact, when you look at photographs from the 1950s, you'll see the borders are very yellowed. And soon after that, the photographs became borderless, in fact. And that's how they sort of solved that problem. By cutting off the border, you wouldn't see that that white border had yellowed so significantly. These materials are typically on a paper support, or they might be on a photographic paper that's coated on both sides with polyethylene, a plastic-coated photographic paper, resin-coated paper that's introduced and popular by the 1960s. Someone else is asking, what is Baryta? And I referred to Baryta earlier when I was talking about the cross-section of photographs. What happened is that early photographs, the salted paper print and the albumen process, these were produced on uncoated paper, good quality, high quality paper that might have been sized with gelatin or starch, but it wasn't really coated with anything. And in the 1880s, they discovered that if they could coat these papers with the white pigment barium sulfate and gelatin, they could create a much brighter surface and therefore much brighter whites. They also could create a much smoother surface. And so in the 1880s, we began to see the introduction of paper that's coated with this Baryta layer, which is white pigment, barium sulfate, and gelatin, coated on the paper to create a white, bright white, reflected surface and a very smooth surface as well. These photographs, therefore, black and white prints tend to be glossier than albumen prints because of the presence of that Baryta layer. And in fact, without taking too much time, let me just go back for a second, because this is an interesting black and white photograph in that you can see that the photographic paper has a texture that begins to mimic, almost mimic canvas. This was a trend that was popular. I'm not sure, some of you can probably date this photograph better than I can based on costume. Maybe the 30s or the 40s, but it was done by texturing that Baryta layer. So you could create, you might have seen in your family collections, heavily textured papers as well, and Baryta allowed manufacturers to do that. So chromogenic color, another great example here, a photograph that we're probably all very familiar with, is comprised of dyes rather than silver. We're not going to talk about negative materials necessarily, but just suffice it to say that these materials are also comprised of a variety of different bases. They might be on glass or on film, but for the most part they're silver images, much like the black and white silver photograph that we talked about earlier. Someone's saying that more modern pictures have a glossy finish, and is this due to dyes? No, not necessarily. The gloss is often due to the paper support, and that very glossy surface that you see may simply be that it's on a resin-coated, a plastic-coated paper with a thicker gelatin layer. Throughout the history of photography, photographers would manipulate surfaces to create very glossy surfaces in a variety of different ways. even with the albumen print, that could be coated and varnished with shellac to create a surface that's glossy, but it typically has nothing to do with the image material, which is the dyes.
Hey, Debbie, there is one question that might be good to address here, which is, are slides the same as photographs or negatives?
Okay, that's a great question. Slides are typically color processes, and they are on a plastic support, so in that way they're like a negative, but the image is comprised of organic dyes in a gelatin binder. So their cross-section is really sort of similar to the color photograph that I show you here or here, but the difference is that they're on a transparent support, either an acetate film or a polyester film. The issue for you all in terms of preservation is that, like the color photographs, these materials will also fade and discolor in the dark and in the light. And you might have seen, actually, if you look at your slide collections and if you have Kodachrome, for example, Kodachrome has very good dark stability, and your Kodachrome slides are probably in excellent condition, which is quite remarkable, really, unless they've been projected many, many times over. Your Ektachrome slides, however, Ektachrome has much poorer dark stability, and they, in fact, may be very magenta in color. The cyan dye may have faded. Some of you also have photographs and photographic albums, as you see here. And so these are, two examples of black and white photographs, silver gelatin photographs. You can see that they're in good condition, but they have begun to mirror at the outer edges. And this is probably caused by the intrusion of air and moisture into that photographic album. Here, if you could house albums in boxes, you can begin to prevent some of that deterioration. One thing you don't want to do is don't disassemble your albums, because they're so important as a unit and as an object, and try to preserve them without taking them apart. Finally, let me just speak for the next 5 minutes or so a little bit, give you a little bit of advice and tips on proper storage, and I can then certainly answer any questions or try to answer any questions that you might have. But so what are a few things that you should keep in the back of your mind? Where possible, house your collections in good quality plastic or paper enclosures and boxes, because the boxes protect them from, again, moisture and temperature, which is what accelerates all the deterioration that we've been talking about, from salted paper and albumen to tintypes, daguerreotypes, to contemporary color materials as well. So where you can house them in good quality enclosures, that's really a great thing to do. And you can put photographs in plastic sleeves, as you see here, and upright into boxes if they're handled a lot by your family. One of the disadvantages of plastic sleeves, however, is that you can't write on them. And in your case particularly, you may want to write notes in pencil on the back of your photographs that identify sitters or information, or on papers that are going to be held in contact with the photographs. Please don't tape that paper on the back of the photograph, just house it separately. But for some of you, plastic enclosures may not be as ideal as paper enclosures. And really, there are many companies, some are listed here, that sell very good quality enclosures for the proper storage of photographic and other materials as well. And I urge you to go to their websites and to look at what they have available. Don't hesitate to contact them with questions that you might have, to ask for samples. You can order boxes, good quality paper enclosures, good quality plastic enclosures from all of these companies and others as well. And I understand, and Stephanie will talk about this at the end, that there'll actually be another webinar later this week about storage enclosures where you can gather more information. Someone's asking, should you use desiccants? And desiccants actually can be very useful because they will absorb moisture. Just don't allow, depending on what you're using, don't allow those materials to get on the surfaces of photographs. But using desiccants in boxes or locally can help to reduce the relative humidity levels and slow down the deterioration. You also can begin to monitor environments. Another excellent resource really for all of you is the Image Permanence Institute website. I mentioned the graphics atlas earlier, but if you just go to their website, you'll see lots of information about environmental management and monitoring. A lot of this is for museums, libraries, and archives, but it certainly applies to family collections as well. And the Image Permanence Institute has done as much as they possibly can do to make this information relevant to all of you. So thinking about how you can control the environment in your home, where your photographs are housed, is important. And again, at the very least, do not store them in the basement or the attic, where they certainly will be prone to deterioration, or in the garage. Be sure that they're protected against emergencies and handle them carefully. And if you're displaying them, you might want to think about displaying facsimiles or copies or digital prints rather than your original photographs. You also may want to think about copying your photographs so that you have facsimiles for your family, and the originals then can be housed in an acid-free box, and everyone has a copy that they can display. If those copies fade or deteriorate, that's not such a terrible problem. There have been lots of studies, and another webinar later this week will also deal a bit with digital materials. And as you see here in this image, these are digital materials that are being tested by the Image Permanence Institute for their stability in an accelerated aging oven, so we can begin to predict how these materials will deteriorate or fade when exposed to light, when exposed to high temperature, when exposed to high relative humidity conditions. But if they're being used for duplicates to hang on your wall, and if they fade, you can copy your originals again. But do think about that. Extended display of these materials may cause them to deteriorate more aggressively. Other resources, and there's a lot out there, and thank goodness for the web. We all understand its strengths and weaknesses. But here are some resources for you to think about. Library of Congress has some terrific information that deals with collections care more broadly, but also photographic materials more specifically. And so you can check that website out. And in the United States, there's many regional conservation centers. These are organizations that service small museums, libraries, archives, even large museums as well, regionally. So for example, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia, or the Northeast Document Conservation Center outside of Boston. These are two of many regional centers, and all of them produce technical leaflets and have information online that deal with preservation of photographic collections. And so I've given you resources here, and this will just allow you to explore these in more detail, where you'll learn tips about where you can buy materials for proper storage, what to be thinking about. And also the National Park Service has these conservograms that are listed here that I think will be helpful to you. Here you can find information about the kinds of boxes, about scanning. Some of the questions that you all are asking certainly can be answered here. One of you is asking about how to tell the differences between these photographs, between the Daguerreotype, the Tintype, the Albumen print, the silver gelatin photograph. And that can be difficult. And what I would say in this brief period of time is certainly you can review these slides. It gives you a little bit of a sense. But the Graphics Atlas is excellent. The Image Permanence Institute for beginning to learn how to differentiate albumen prints, for example, from silver gelatin photographs. Some of this has to do with dating. So the albumen photograph is popular in the 19th century. The silver gelatin black and white photograph is popular in the 20th century. So we think about date, we think about image color. Is it brown in color, which is typical of these 19th century materials produced through contact printing and through the sun, through contact printing in the sun? Or is the image black and white in color, produced in a dark room using a chemical developer? The reality, without getting too technical here, is that the albumen photograph and the silver gelatin black and white photograph, although they're both comprised of silver images, that silver is very different in its form, in its structure, in the way it absorbs and scatters light. And for that reason, the albumen print appears more brown in color, the black and white print appears more black and white, unless it deteriorates. And so you can begin to distinguish these processes through image color, through date, and also the way they deteriorate. That silver mirroring, that iridescence that I showed you earlier with the woman we thought was from the 1930s, that kind of deterioration is more typical with black and white photographs, silver gelatin photographs, than with albumen prints. Albumen prints, in comparison, they tend to crack and craze because of that egg white binder layer, or yellow, because the egg white yellows. And so you begin to see differences in deterioration, and then finally the surface quality also can help you to distinguish some of the different printing papers. Is there a baryta layer? Is it not? Is it glossy? Is it matte? So all of these various clues are sort of brought together to help distinguish one process from another. And again, I think you'll find that the graphics atlas is very clear and quite beautiful, really, in allowing you to begin to understand what are the characteristics of these different processes. So when you go back to your home collections, you can, with greater ease, distinguish an albumen print from perhaps a collodion chloride printing out photograph from a silver gelatin developing out photograph from a chromogenic photograph. The daguerreotype is on silver-plated copper, and you can distinguish that because it's very highly reflective. If you hold it in your hand and you move it back and forth, you'll see your self in it. It's like a mirror, and that's typical of a daguerreotype. A tintype is not as reflective. It's on silver-plated. I mean, it's not on silver-plated copper. It's on iron. If the tintype is loose, you'll be able to examine it and see that it's actually on iron that's coated with a black lacquer. One of you have asked about the ambrotype process, which is the other process, the other direct positive process that was popular at this time, and that's actually on glass. And so the ambrotype is about the same time period as the daguerreotype, but it's on glass. It looks a little bit more three-dimensional. It's not as reflective or mirror-like as the daguerreotype. So you can begin to distinguish these three processes, the daguerreotype, the ambrotype, and the tintype, by their reflection, by their date, and also by their deterioration. The tintype will rust, it's iron. The ambrotype is on glass. You may see glass deterioration. So I hope that's a long-winded answer. I hope that that's helpful for those of you who may be sort of struggling with how to differentiate some of these materials. It is really important for you to recognize that we have in the field of conservation our membership organization, the American Institute for Conservation, and the AIC website is also very useful to all of you because it has information not just for conservators but also for the general public. And so this is another website that you might wish to explore. There's brochures that you can print out on how to care for photographs, but also it can help you identify conservators in your area so that you can reach out, and if you have particular questions, you might be able to speak to them. They might be able to help you, and they might be able to help you with issues surrounding the preservation of your collections as well as the conservation treatment of photographs that are badly deteriorated. And just to show you one example of the kinds of things that can be done in terms of conservation treatment, which is one aspect of our field. When you're involved in the conservation of photographic materials, you may be involved in education and training. You may be involved in examination and documentation or scientific analysis of these materials, research to better understand how they were made and how they deteriorate, connoisseurship studies, as well as conservation treatment for those materials, as you see here, that are very badly deteriorated. This is a photograph from the 1920s. It is a black and white photograph, but it has been sepia toned. One of you asked earlier about sepia toning. So this is a photograph that was black and white that's now brown in color. And you can see that the image is actually in very good condition. But it is very badly deteriorated physically. It's broken in half. The mount, the mat is detached. And in this case, this is this photograph before treatment at the Conservation Center. It was examined and documented, and here it is after conservation treatment. In this case, the tear has been mended. You can barely make it out. It's beautiful here. Using Japanese paper and wheat starch paste, the adhesives have been removed, and the photograph is now in a much more stable condition. So this is just one example of many of the kinds of activities that conservators can help you with if you have individual photographs that have very high value and you're interested in actually having them conserved or treated in this way. But please note that the main focus that you want to make on your own collections is to be sure that you understand what they are, that they're documented, and that they've been housed properly. One of you asked about what issues might cigarette smoke pose for family photographs. Cigarette smoke will deposit itself on the surfaces of photographs that are not framed or glazed or protected with plastic enclosures, and it can be very difficult to remove. Here's where I wish I could quickly transition to other images, and I could show you some of the work. Actually, it's interesting that Heather, one of the photographs Heather treated this year as a second-year student, was a wedding portrait that was very badly damaged with cigarette smoke, to the point that the surface was very gray and very discolored. We were able to remove it under the microscope and using dampened cotton swabs, and so it is possible, if you have photographs in your collection that are damaged in this way, that they can be treated by a trained conservator. Someone else is asking if I guess you're asking if photographs framed in glass damage photographs. I'm not sure if I quite understand it, but nonetheless, I think it reminds me, because I see things are coming up here, I'm trying to read them, but I wanted to mention something. It reminds me of something that is very important for all of you in framing photographs. Be sure that these photographs are not framed directly against glass, because what happens, if you think back to that cross-section, we just use this photograph for example, as an example. Let's say that this photograph is now treated, it looks beautiful, and you want to display this particular photograph in your living room. What you don't want to do is have it framed directly against glass, because remember, the binder is gelatin. So this is a silver image in a gelatin binder, and when gelatin gets damp or wet, it becomes tacky and sticky. And what will happen then is the photograph can become stuck or adhere to the glass, and you may have seen this in your own collections. This is a common problem with photographs that are framed directly against glass or plexiglass, so be sure that photographs are always matted in some way. There's some kind of a good quality acid-free board between the photograph and the glazing. And where possible, look to glaze these materials with ultraviolet filtering plexiglass or glass, something like Optium glazing, that will minimize the light levels, the ultraviolet light levels. And it's ultraviolet light, high energy light, that can cause photographs to deteriorate more rapidly. So do be very careful about framing photographs. And with photographic albums as well, I see a few questions on albums that are coming up. It's a similar problem, because these photographs are, of course, one against another in a box, and so if it gets damp or wet, these things may all begin to stick together. Some owners will interleave photographic albums with lightweight, good quality paper to try and prevent that damage. It's not to say it will prevent it, but it's something to think about, that is interleaving with a good quality paper where the photographic album can accommodate that additional paper. You don't want to break the binding. Again, I wouldn't be so worried about this if the album is in a box in a generally well-protected area. It doesn't get damp or wet. We've spent an awful lot of time in our graduate program responding to emergencies, most recently Superstorm Sandy, trying to help individuals care for their photographs that have been damaged by immersion in water or exposure to high relative humidity conditions. And the greatest challenge really are these gelatin binder layers that swell and become tacky and sticky. Let me just say a few more things, and then I can continue to answer questions. I just want to say another site that may be helpful for any of you who are interested in learning more about not necessarily just the field of art conservation, but may be interested in pursuing this as a career. Our Art Conservation Department website has lots of information about our undergraduate, master's level, and doctoral program in preservation studies, but also many interesting articles I think you'll find on conservation and preservation more generally, as well as articles on photograph conservation. And just to say that we really are working around the world. This problem that we're addressing here today on family photographs is one that resonates around the world, and one project that I'm particularly proud of is our work in the Middle East with the Arab Image Foundation, where in collaboration with the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Getty Conservation Institute, we have been working with collections across the Middle East and helping them to preserve their rich photographic heritage. Here are two wonderful albumen photographs that you see here. Again, brown in color, but generally in very good condition. And helping them with the preservation of these materials from Abu Dhabi, as you see here, to Iran, Iraq, Syria, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, etc. And I say this simply to illustrate that these issues, these challenges that we face with photographs are common. Albumen prints, daguerreotypes, tintypes, silver gelatin, developed out photographs, color photographs are found around the world. And in the end, whatever we can do to control handling, to minimize handling, to ensure that they're well protected, and to better understand what these materials are, we will be better positioned to care for them together. Let's see what questions. Stephanie, are there questions that have come up? This is just a great image that I ended on that just shows you, I mean, here's a wide variety of family photographs. This is an amazing collection that someone brought to us to sort of advise them on, where do I start? And, where do you start in this case? You need to begin to separate out and try to see if you can begin to identify some of these individuals. You should be wearing cotton gloves. Yes, someone asked, should you wear cotton gloves when handling photographs? Yes, please do so, because the oils in your hand can cause photographs to fade and deteriorate. These materials then can be sort of grouped by date, 19th and 20th century. They should be housed in good quality enclosures and good quality boxes. And certainly in some cases may be scanned, and those scanned images shared with other family members. It looks like, some people are saying it looks like their family collection, and you would be so fortunate to have, I mean, it's great for those who have collections like this. It's really wonderful. Yeah, sorry, Stephanie.
That's okay. There are a few questions, there's a few themes. One is, could you provide a little bit of advice on how people should label their photographs?
Okay, that's
pencil, label enclosures, label the piece.
Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. The best solution where possible is to label the enclosures. And this is possible if you're using paper enclosures. Not so possible if you're using plastic enclosures. Or you can label the back of the photograph using a soft pencil. And just be careful in doing that, because sometimes the pressure, and the reason I'm saying a soft pencil is you can imagine with these very glossy papers, particularly when they're thin photographic papers, you can actually emboss them, and you might have seen this in your own collection. So use a soft pencil, place the photograph face down on a piece of mat board so it has some protection, and you can label directly on the back. But avoid inks because they can transfer and cause problems. And if you can label the enclosure, that's preferred, but it's not always possible.
Okay, another question. Quite a few people are asking about what should they do if either their photos are stuck to the glass in the frame, or if their photos are stuck to each other.
To each other.
What would you advise?
Yeah, okay, this is probably where, and again, why are they sticking to each other? It's that gelatin binder, which when it gets wet, it gets tacky and sticky like an adhesive. This is probably where it's best to identify a conservator, and going to the American Institute for Conservation website, you can go online and there's a section that says select a conservator, and you can sort of log in what you have, a photograph, where you live, and they will provide you with a list of conservators in your area, photograph conservators in your area. And I think in that case it's best to seek out advice, because what happens is it's very difficult to remove photographs that are adhered to glass. In fact, Heather and I were working on one just recently as one of her projects. Sometimes it can be done, so that's the good news. It often requires the addition of moisture, but in a very controlled way, because the emulsions become very deteriorated and almost water soluble. Yeah. So don't throw them away. But don't try this yourself, and be sure to consult with a conservator for those photographs that are stuck together or adhere to glass in a frame.
What would you recommend for the old magnetic albums?
Yeah, the old magnetic albums. You can have two problems with these. One is all the photographs are falling out completely because the adhesive has failed. And then you might as well just take it apart and put them into other enclosures. You will still have adhesive on the back because that magnetic, it's adhesive that's sort of in linear form, and just leave it because it's probably not tacky or sticky anymore. The other option, unfortunately the more common problem, is that they're completely stuck and they're never going to come out of those pages. And in that case, I would just leave them, honestly, because once you start dismantling them, they're hard to dismantle. It probably has to be done by a conservator. And you might find that the photographs are still in relatively good condition. And these albums, as an album, and the way things were constructed, the photographs one next to another, you begin to lose all that when you take these albums apart. So for the most part, leave them as is, put them in boxes. If they're falling apart, you might have to disassemble them. But don't purchase any more of those magnetic albums. They're still available on the market, and they're just generally not very permanent. They create all kinds of problems for photograph conservators and others. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. I think we're at time, so maybe one more quick question. I guess a lot of people have been asking about whether it's okay to scan their photographs if that causes damage from, basically light of...
Yeah, that's a good question. It is okay to scan your photographs. You have to handle them carefully. Someone had asked about using gloves. Recognize that some of the greatest damage is actually through handling. So, maybe put a piece of clear polyester Mylar film on the scanner, on the plate, and then put the photograph face down on that. But exposing it briefly to light is really just fine. You don't want to scan a photograph 500 times. Then you might see some fading. But once is fine, and just be cautious of the way you're handling the photographs, and you should be okay. It's the same as photocopying, which we used to do. What it does, of course, is it prevents further handling because now you have a scanned copy. And it makes these materials available so they can be appreciated and enjoyed by others.
Okay. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for.
Hey, Stephanie, can I jump in on just one quick question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Someone saying, what is a good album? Because we were talking about magnetic albums. Just go to the, you can buy good quality photographic albums from the various archival suppliers. So start with those catalogs, go online. They have lots of different photographic albums that are made of plastic pages that are very high quality and would be perfectly safe for your family photographs. So check that out. I hope that helps.
Yes.
Yeah, well, and I'll just say it's been a real privilege. It's an adjustment doing webinars. Again, I love seeing everyone, and I wish we could ask more questions, but hopefully this has provided you with some guidance and some ideas of the variety of materials and where to go to get more information. And I look forward to future webinars, certainly. And I want to especially thank you, Stephanie, and your organizers for putting this all together, because it takes a lot of time, and sort of dedicating this entire week to preservation is really a wonderful thing.
Well, thanks, Debbie. And thanks for the great presentation. I think you've given everybody lots of really wonderful tips to help them preserve their photographs, so thank you. So I'm going to do my little wrap-up now. For more information about preservation, please visit ALA's Preservation Week website, where you can find great tips and resources to help you preserve your photographs and other family treasures. And thanks again to today's sponsor, Archival Products. We would also like to thank our Preservation Week spokesperson, Steve Berry, for his support of preservation in ALA's Preservation Week. And last but not least, thanks to Amy Lana and Iping Chen Gaffey for their technical assistance. Please consider joining us for our next 2 Preservation Week webinars. If you're interested in more information on preserving photographs, tomorrow's webinar will discuss preserving digital photographs, and Thursdays will discuss how to choose archival supplies like photo sleeves and archival boxes. More information about these and other upcoming webinars, web courses, and e-forums can be found on the ALCTS webinar website. We hope you found today's session helpful. You'll soon receive a short online evaluation form, and please take a few minutes to fill it out and return it to us. Your comments help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee evaluate and plan future continuing education opportunities. And if you're interested in viewing parts of the presentation again or sharing it with others, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording shortly after the conclusion of the webinar. The presentation will also be archived and freely available at the ALCTS webinar website and the ALCTS Continuing Education channel on YouTube. Thank you again for joining us today. Goodbye.